What if I told you that everything you think you know about Thor is completely wrong? That the god of thunder you've watched save the world in 8 Marvel movies bears almost no resemblance to the actual Norse deity that Vikings worshipped over 1,000 years ago? Well, buckle up, because we're about to dive into the most mind-blowing mythology comparison you've ever heard, and by the end of this 4-part series, you'll never look at the Marvel Cinematic Universe the same way again. I'm about to reveal how Marvel took 5 of the most powerful and complex Norse gods and turned them into something completely different. We're talking about Thor, Loki, Odin, Heimdall, and Freya. Characters you think you know, but trust me, you absolutely don't. The real stories are so much more fascinating, disturbing, and downright shocking that Hollywood had to completely reinvent them just to make them suitable for audiences. Let's start with the big one, Thor himself. When you picture Thor, you probably see Chris Hemsworth, right? Tall, blonde, impossibly handsome, with perfect flowing hair and a chiseled jawline that could cut diamonds. Well, here's your first reality check. The real Thor from Norse mythology looked nothing like a Hollywood heartthrob. In fact, he was described as having fiery red hair and a massive bushy red beard that would make a lumberjack jealous. His eyes blazed like lightning itself, and when he got angry, which was often, his beard would literally spark with electricity. But here's where it gets really interesting. Marvel's Thor is this noble, somewhat naive prince who's learning to be worthy of his power. The mythological Thor? He was essentially the Viking equivalent of a cosmic berserker. This guy's favorite pastime wasn't protecting Earth, it was hunting down and brutally slaughtering giants for sport. We're talking about a god who once dressed up as a bride just to get close enough to a giant to smash his skull in with his hammer. That's not exactly the heroic behavior we see in the movies, is it? The hammer itself tells an incredible story that Marvel completely ignored. Mjolnir wasn't some elegant weapon forged in the heart of a dying star. According to actual Norse sources, it was created by the dwarven brothers Atri and Brokkr during a bet with Loki. And here's the kicker. It was actually defective. The handle was too short, because Loki, in his typical trickster fashion, had transformed into a fly and kept biting the dwarf who was working the bellows, causing him to mess up the crafting process. So this legendary weapon that's supposed to be the pinnacle of divine craftsmanship was literally a manufacturing error. And speaking of that hammer, let's talk about what it actually did. Marvel shows us this clean, precise weapon that flies perfectly through the air and returns to Thor's hand like a loyal pet. The real Mjolnir was described as a weapon of absolute devastation that would literally never miss its target and would level mountains when it struck. But here's what Marvel didn't tell you. It was so heavy and so powerful that Thor needed special iron gloves called Jarngriper just to hold it, and he had to wear a belt called Mjolnir that doubled his already incredible strength just to lift the thing. Now let's get into Thor's actual personality, because this is where Marvel really went off the rails. Chris Hemsworth's Thor starts as this arrogant but ultimately good-hearted prince who learns humility. The mythological Thor was basically the ancient equivalent of that friend who's always ready to fight someone at a bar. He was quick to anger, loved violence, and his solution to almost every problem was to hit it with his hammer until it stopped being a problem. There's a story where he gets so angry at his goats, yes, he rode goats, not horses, that he breaks one of their legs just because he was hungry and wanted to eat it, then resurrects it the next day like nothing happened. But here's what makes the real Thor actually more fascinating than the Marvel version. He was the protector of humanity not because he was noble and pure, but because he genuinely loved a good fight, and giants threatening humans gave him an excuse to go out and bash some skulls. He wasn't saving people out of altruism. He was doing it because it was fun. There's something refreshingly honest about a god who admits he enjoys violence rather than pretending it's all about duty and honor. The Marvel Cinematic Universe also completely sanitized Thor's family relationships. In the movies, we see this somewhat dysfunctional but ultimately loving family dynamic between Thor, Odin, and Loki. The real Norse family tree? It's a nightmare of betrayal, violence, and dysfunction that would make the most twisted soap opera look like a children's show. Thor and Loki weren't brothers. They weren't even close friends most of the time. Their relationship was complicated, sure, but it involved way more attempted murder and way less heartfelt reconciliation than Marvel would have you believe. Here's something that'll blow your mind. The real Thor was actually prophesied to die at Ragnarok, not in some noble sacrifice to save the universe, but in mutual destruction with the world serpent Jörmungandr. Picture this. At the end of the world, Thor fights this massive serpent that's so large it encircles the entire world. He kills it, but then takes exactly 9 steps before dying from its poison. That's it. No resurrection, no last-minute save, no clever trick to avoid fate. Just death after 9 steps. Now that's the kind of ending that would never make it into a Marvel movie. But here's what really gets me about Marvel's version. They turn Thor into this fish-out-of-water comedy character who doesn't understand Earth culture and says things like, "I need a horse." The real Thor wasn't some naive alien prince. He was intimately connected to human civilization. He was the god that regular people actually worshipped and prayed to. When a Viking farmer's crops were threatened by drought, he didn't pray to Odin the All-Father. He prayed to Thor, the Thunderbringer. When storms threatened their ships, they called on Thor. He was the people's god, not some distant royal figure. And let's talk about his actual powers for a second, because Marvel really undersold this guy. Sure, movie Thor can fly and control lightning, but mythological Thor could literally control all weather. Drought, storms, rain, snow, all of it was under his command. His chariot was pulled across the sky by 2 massive goats named Tangrisnir and Tangjoster, and when their hooves struck the clouds, that's what created thunder. Every thunderstorm you've ever experienced was supposedly Thor traveling across the heavens. The most fascinating thing about the real Thor, though, is that he represented something fundamental about Norse culture that Marvel completely missed. He wasn't just a superhero. He was the embodiment of the Viking ideal of controlled violence. Vikings didn't see violence as inherently evil. They saw it as a tool that could be used for good or ill. Thor represented violence used to protect what you love, to defend your community, to stand up against impossible odds even when you know you might lose. This brings us to something Marvel got completely backwards about Thor's character arc. In the movies, we watch Thor learn to be more peaceful, more diplomatic, more like the civilized heroes we're used to. But the real Thor was never supposed to become more peaceful. He was supposed to teach humans when violence was necessary and when it was justified. He was the god who said, "Sometimes you have to fight, and when you do, you better hit hard enough to end it." Now, I've just scratched the surface of how Marvel transformed Thor, and we haven't even gotten to the really shocking stuff yet. Because if you think Thor's transformation is dramatic, wait until you hear what they did to Loki. We're talking about a character so complex and morally ambiguous that Marvel had to completely reinvent not just his personality, but his entire species, his relationship with the other gods, and even his gender identity, just to make him fit into their cinematic universe. And that's not even the most dramatic change they made. When we get to Odin in the next part of this series, you're going to discover that the All-Father you think you know is actually based on one of the most morally questionable gods in any mythology. We're talking about a deity who makes Loki look like a saint by comparison. But here's what I really want you to think about as we wrap up this first part. Why did Marvel feel the need to change these characters so dramatically? What was it about the real Norse gods that made them unsuitable for modern audiences? Because when you really dig into the authentic mythology, you start to realize that these weren't just stories about gods and monsters. They were complex explorations of morality, power, family, and what it means to be human in a chaotic universe. The real Norse mythology doesn't give you easy answers or clear-cut heroes and villains. It gives you complicated characters making difficult choices in impossible situations, and that's exactly what we're going to explore in the next 3 parts of this series. Because once you understand who these gods really were, you'll start to see patterns in how Marvel changed all of them. And those patterns reveal something fascinating about what we want from our modern myths versus what ancient people needed from theirs. So make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell, because in part 2, We're diving deep into the most controversial character transformation of all, Loki, the god who was so much more than just Thor's adopted brother, and whose real story involves shape-shifting, gender swapping, and giving birth to monsters that will literally end the world.